Hello, everyone. I'm Thea Wieseltier of 70 Faces Media. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for being part of my Jewish learning and all of our brands. This is going to be an exciting conversation, and I'm excited to get started. So allow me to introduce our guests, and then we'll begin. Before I forget, please put any questions, comments in the chat, because we will get to them. So, Cynthia Gorney is a contributing writer for National Geographic, the former Washington Post national reporter and South American bureau chief. She spent 16 years on the faculty of UC Berkeley's Graduate School of Journalism, has written for many magazines, including The New Yorker and the New York Times Magazine, is the author of Articles of Faith, A Frontline History of the Abortion Wars. She also happens to be a descendant, like Jordan Salama, you will hear about in a moment, of Latin American Jews. The reason we are all here is Jordan Salama. New book coming out, Strangers in the Desert. Jordan Salama is the author of Strangers in the Desert, an intergenerational family story that chronicles a journey across Argentina in search of traces of his Syrian Jewish great-grandfather, a traveling salesman in the Andes. His essay and reporting have appeared in National Geographic, the New York Times, New York Magazine, and other national and international publications. He is the author of Every Day, The River Changes, A River Journey Through Colombia, which was named a Kirkus Review Best Book of 2021, and the pre-read at Princeton University, where he graduated in 2019. Please enjoy. I now welcome Cynthia Gorney and Jordan Salama.
It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to ask Jordan some questions. Jordan and I became friends when he joined the staff of National Geographic for a time. And one of the very first things that we connected over was I read his past and I sent him a message saying, "Your background sounds as weird as mine, Jordan." He of course is as he will talk about at length, is the child of Syrian and Iraqi Jews. I happen to be the child of Mexican Polish Jews. His people went through Argentina. Mine, of course, went through Mexico. And Jordan, I think the very first thing I want to ask you about this wonderful book is the most obvious. How did this begin? What got you going?
Definitely. Well, first of all, I also am thrilled to be doing this with you because you took me under your wing at National Geographic, which is a hard place to find a footing in. And together we worked on stories together and we explored our histories. And now that we're able to share this is really special. So thank you. And thanks to everybody who's here. This is a project that transformed my life in a lot of different ways, but it all began when I was a sophomore in college. And I went downstairs to my 95-year-old grandfather's basement in Peekskill, New York, and I found an old binder sitting on his desk. And the binder was like filled with yellowing papers and photos falling out the sides. And it was just labeled in Spanish, Historia Antigua, the ancient history, like family, the story. And I was like, what is this? I opened it up, and inside the first few pages described 500 years of my Jewish family's wandering past, from Inquisition era Spain to Ottoman Syria to Argentina and Latin America and beyond, eventually migrating in the 1960s, my grandparents to New York. So for a while, I wasn't sure if my grandfather wanted me to know that this book existed, because I assumed he'd kept it secret for so long that clearly he didn't want to show it to me.
I want to ask you a question about that moment, Jordan. Can you describe it just a little bit more, what it was like looking at these pages that your grandfather had written, I assume, in his own handwriting or collected? How did what you were looking at fit in with whatever you thought you understood about? And this is your paternal grandfather that we're talking about, right?
This is my paternal grandfather.
Yeah. What did that feel like?
Yeah, I mean, my mom's side of the family is from Iraq, and they came straight to the United States, and they had kind of like a transported clan from Baghdad to Nassau County, Long Island. But my dad,
let's remember, also Iraqi Jews, correct?
Iraqi Jews, right, left in the 1970s, like one of the last Jewish families to flee.
Mm-hmm.
My dad's family, though, it was just my grandparents who left Argentina in the 60s and came to New York. And so there was not like a ready-made clan there for storytelling. And so I never heard any of these things before. I kind of had a connection to Argentina through soccer and through little things like mate. But really, I just knew it was my grandparents and they spoke Spanish to each other and they never spoke it to me. And then so to then to come across this Geniza of sort, it was like a buried treasure, basically. And there it was all laid out for me. The first few pages about our history, but then most of it were like handwritten poems and history and photos from my grandfather's own youth, stories that he, compiled over 90 something years of life. And to hold that in my hands, also surrounded kind of by his basement library, which is a super special place that I described in the book, was really amazing. And so when he eventually caught me reading this thing, and I was, would sneak away from family gatherings to read this old book, he was like, no, 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 like we should read it together. And that's when we started to speak in Spanish together for the first time.
Okay, so you had not had a relationship with your grandfather in Spanish before this time.
No, never. He and my grandmother always spoke it with each other, but never to us.
This is climbing right into my heart, right? My father and I didn't start speaking to each other in Spanish until his very later years, when he was starting actually to forget his English because his mind was going and he reverted to his first language. And and this is a question that applies to any either child or grandchild of immigrants, which is why I'm so interested in it. Was your different in any way in Spanish?
Oh my God, so different. I
How?
realized well, there was this whole side to him that I never knew. My grandmother too, like with Abuela, we also never spoke in Spanish. But then once all of this began, our relationship deepened in so many ways. They were storytellers. They were not shy people. That was the biggest difference here, is that before where they were reticent and the people who I thought maybe never wanted to tell these stories because they weren't surrounded by other relatives, here they were like warmed by the country of their hearts and the culture of their hearts and reciting tangos and wanting to kind of speak in long, flowing, romantic ways that were clearly Argentine, but that just don't translate well into English. And it started to like all the stories just took on far more color than they ever would have had if it was in English, which is obviously it makes sense. Like it's not their first language. So being able to have that first language relationship with them, even though it's not my first language, was really amazing.
Did you learn anything from them at that point about the relationship between their Argentine Spanish and it had been Arabic, right? I mean, it was not just Arabic, if I remember correctly, right? The language
Right.
that preceded the immigration to Argentina.
Right. So we're talking about a family of like layers upon layers. It's almost like sediment of
Yeah, you're
uh,
going to have to, for those people who haven't had a chance to look at the book yet, this is going to be your moment to do a quick verbal summation of this insanely complicated family tree, right? So use your hands if you need to, right? But we've
okay.
got mom's side, Iraq to US. Yeah? Okay.
Yeah.
Dad's side, go. Right.
Dad's side, Syrian Jews, some of whom descended from Sephardic Jews from Spain and others from the Mostarabi Jews who, like the Iraqi Jews, have been in the region for a couple thousand years, merged together in Damascus, and in the early 20th century, at the fall of the Ottoman Empire, say, I want to get on a boat bound for America and end up in Argentina instead.
Okay. And so your grandfather's very young when this happens, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. He's like 20.
Okay. Okay. So he's already lived a young adult life. He's 20. So he's lived a young adult life there in Syria. Now he's going to start all over again in a certain way in Argentina, right? And
Right.
Argentina is where he's been. Okay. Okay.
This is my great grandfather, not Abuelo from Peekskill.
Oh, your great grandfather. Okay.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. And remind us your great grandfather's name.
A name that is never going to be forgotten. Salim Salama. What a name.
What a name.
When I came across that name in the book, that's when you realize that you've come across a good character because his name is Salim Salama. How can you not pay attention to Salim Salama?
What did you start learning in the book in the basement about Salim Salama?
I learned that when he got to Argentina, most of the Syrian Jews ended up in Buenos Aires, and he did eventually too. But first, he went to a city called Mendoza in the central Andes, so the western part of Argentina and kind of the center of the country, and started to work as a traveling salesman with a horse-drawn cart in the mountains between Mendoza and the border with Bolivia, which was like 1,000 miles north. Now, this is not a normal thing that people do. At least I thought when I first read this. And so he would go with this cart and for 3 months at a time and come back with silver to show for his sales of clothes and textiles. And there was a rumor in this whole thing that he also left behind kids, like long lost children in the mountains of Argentina. So much so that my grandfather, when he was growing up, heard rumors from his friends about his father's gallivantings and his maybe potentially long lost siblings. So that was like the kind of picture of Salim Salama that I had, was this guy
I
going
think
through
it's
the mountains.
useful for anybody who isn't familiar with that part of the world. It's probably useful to remember to paint the picture. Buenos Aires, even then, is like, I don't know, to Argentina, it's like New York and Chicago and San Francisco combined. I'm sorry, New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles combined. It is like the urban center. And help people understand how different, how cosmopolitan Buenos Aires is then, and how different it is to land in Mendoza, and what that terrain is like that Salim Salama is living in.
Yeah, I mean, the era that we're talking about, which is around 1920, we're seeing, first of all, a time when 1 out of every 4 people in the current territory of Argentina is an immigrant. So a huge immigration boom of Italians, people from the Ottoman Empire, people from Spain, all over the place. But then you have a kind of vastly diverse country in terms of landscapes and also peoples, indigenous peoples, and then people who then expanded out and displaced those indigenous peoples in the Pampas, in Patagonia, and in the, the northwestern Andes. So that kind of coincided with a railroad building boom that was the Italians and the English were kind of controlling, and with the railroads came all these people who were starting businesses. So, okay, why did Syrian and Lebanese people end up in the northwestern Andes? Well, everything has these answers. The climate of the northwestern Andes of Argentina is almost identical to the climate of the Levant. They grow apricots, they grow olives, and that's why they found comfort there. So it was first Christians and then Jews who followed and made lives for themselves in the northwestern Andes. And then there were these peddlers like Salim Salama who went to sell to them.
And how were the Jews viewed in that era when they first came?
So the Jews from Syria and basically the Jews from the Ottoman Empire had this name that was ascribed to them, Turcos, Turks. And that was because of the Ottoman passports that they carried when they entered into Argentina. But Turco ended up becoming a kind of identity, like an all-encompassing identity that with it was attached a reputation. And that reputation was this kind of hardy, self-made immigrant who would go out into the lonely countryside and work for him or herself, trying to make a living. The name Turcos, though, almost became synonymous with traveling salesmen at one point, especially in the Argentine countryside. And so did Jews in a lot of ways in that sense, because there were not just Turcos, but there were also Cuentenics, which Cynthia, I know also kind of corresponds with your family's history in the port of Veracruz in Mexico.
Right.
Right? This like kind of merging of profession with ethnicity and religion.
Exactly. No, this is one of the things that Jordan and I were exclaiming over is, although I never heard the term Turco, because I don't think it's used so much in Mexico, but my grandfather was a Mexican Turco. My grandfather's in an old Model T. He's younger. He's sort of a half a generation younger than your great grandfather, barely. But he's driving around selling Excedrin, the early versions of Excedrin, Café Aspirina in this ancient truck up in the mountains in Mexico, way far away. So the connections are fascinating, right? And they're both, and in Mexico as in Argentina, they're basically invited in by presidents of a developing nation who explicitly want Jews as well as other people to come in and help build the nation.
Right, right. And
at what point did you decide to actually get up and go to follow Salim?
yeah, I think that it gets to this question of what happens when you find a treasure like this and a story like this that's so attention grabbing that you're like, I can't not find out what happened to Salim Salama and what happened to his long lost descendants. But it came at a time in my life when, I didn't know really what I wanted to do in terms of a career or profession. I was feeling kind of lost. I also didn't really understand my own place in the world in terms of my identity. In this country where we're almost fixated on identity and we're forced to put ourselves into boxes, I felt like I was just kind of big mix of a lot of things and didn't fit particularly with a certain category in all the different groups that I was a part of and where I grew up in the suburbs of New York.
Talk a little bit more, just hold on that thought just for a minute. There's a passage on page 15 of your book that I really want you to read because it feels relevant to what you just said.
Okay.
Where it's the last paragraph where you're talking about abuelo and abuela's house. And if you could start with just impeccably clean. This is the house of your abuelo and abuela, is of course how you say grandma and grandpa, grandfather and grandmother in Spanish. Impeccably clean. Start from there. Read to the end of that paragraph, if you would, please.
Okay. Impeccably clean with smooth floors and soft carpets. It is a home defined by a particular blend of places and memories and identities that cross continents and oceans, from Latin America to the Levant. For we are Jews, and we are Arabs, and we are Americans, Americans from the United States, but also Latin Americans. We are Arab Jews, and Arab Jews everywhere have had to become experts at trying to remember all that the world wishes for us to forget.
Talk more about that. What does that mean for you?
In my being, and I think a lot of people who I've now spoken with about this book feel the same way. I hold multiple identities and histories and heritages in one person. And some of those identities I call identities in conflict. Because in a world where, a world filled with cynicism and rage and also actual real geopolitical conflict, it can be very easy to feel like you're kind of torn into two. That you can't exist in your kind of Middle Eastern identity, your Arab identity, with your Jewish identity, because Jews are supposed to be against Arabs and Arabs are against Jews. Or maybe that, you can't fully embrace your Jewishness in Latin America because that's not something that in the United States people think of as two things that go together. So maybe you're not Hispanic enough in Hispanic circles, but then you're also definitely Latin in Jewish circles or Arab or so. So it's just like you constantly feel like the other. And at one point, I told Abuelo before I was leaving on this journey, I said, I'm nervous, and he said, "Don't be nervous, because if you feel like you don't belong anywhere, it probably means that you belong a little bit everywhere." So if you feel like, again, I'll repeat that. If you feel like you don't belong anywhere, it probably means that you belong a little bit everywhere. And I took that really to heart. And I used that in this journey and in this search to try to make connections with people and build these bridges that I wouldn't have otherwise built, to try to find answers to this family mystery.
What were you looking for? I mean, there were a lot of things, but what were you really? I mean, let's be honest, we're writers, so part of it is that you're looking for a book. But beyond that, right? What were you looking for?
Well, actually, at the time when I went looking for when this started and while I was looking for the lost Salamas, I wasn't a writer yet. I mean, I knew I kind of wanted to be a writer, but I didn't know what kind of writer I wanted to be. I definitely wasn't looking for a book. I was looking, I got a fellowship grant, and I was like, I had a summer, and I wanted to do this project, and I wanted to solve the mystery. I wanted to know what happened to Salim Salama, because I was kind of angling from this place, a place somewhere, and I wanted to kind of stake my claim. And I felt like if I could solve this thing in the wandering library of my family, I could make a claim for myself. I could figure something out.
Wait, so wait, what was the mystery? It wasn't just about whether Salam left little Salams around the mountains. What was the central mystery?
Well, the central mystery was also, why did he work in the way that he worked? Like, why did he go and work in this way, ostensibly being from somewhere so different? And the lost Salamas were kind of like a symbol of that. Like, what did he leave behind in his travels along the way? What identities did he pick up and take with him? And then what hints of a trace of a life did he leave behind in the Andes along the way? And that was really what I was looking for.
I'm laughing because my brothers and I are now talking about going to look for the lost abuelitos, because we're sure there are little Gornies out there somewhere who just never, it's really up there in northern Mexico, and if there's anybody in this audience who thinks they might be related to a Polish Turco who is traveling up in northern Mexico, please get in touch with me afterward. I want to know you. Right.
Oh, please. Oh, and I'll actually use that as a chance to put in the chat and plug this thing that I was telling you about, which is a way to get in touch with each other, which is that at all of my events, I've been bringing this guest book around, which is a beautiful notebook that has people's names, emails, and where their family heritage is from. And eventually what we want to do with all of this is kind of build a community of curious seekers and family historians who want to connect with others and try to solve these mysteries for themselves. So the plan is eventually to kind of segment people and based on where they're from and what things they have in common, to put people into groups, into discussion groups, to be able to share resources and ideas.
Was there any point in the start of this journey where anybody in your family, the abuelos in particular, winced and said, I don't really want you going out and looking for my father's illegitimate kids? That's not cool. How did that go?
Yeah, and in the planning of this, I reached out to family across Latin America, in Spain and in the US, asking them about what they knew of this legend. And there were people who were not happy. Like my 101-year-old great aunt in Barcelona, Tia Teresa, on the phone, I could almost hear her like having a conniption saying, no, 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 nunca, nunca, nunca esto pasaría, nunca. Like this could never happen. It would never, ever be the case that her father could do something so scandalous. But I kept pushing, and there were notebooks supposedly that existed, but then were lost suspiciously. Like things reappeared conveniently and disappeared conveniently. So people definitely had their opinions. But then for everybody who was like not excited about this, there were the people like Abuelo, who were extremely curious and willing to not only share stories with me, but then put me in touch with people on the ground who could try to help me.
And he was interested in the idea that he might have half siblings that were out there.
Absolutely, absolutely.
That's who this would be for him. Wow. There's a line in your book, Jordan, that was really interesting to me, where you talk about feeling that you're part of the generations that want to understand. And I was wondering as I read this, whether you think is there something here particular to immigrants' kids, to Jewish kids who are often immigrants' kids or immigrants' grandkids, or to your generation of people who have, of course, resources into the past and into the world that were not even thinkable 25 years ago. So what do you mean by that?
I wonder what you think about this too, but I think that it definitely stems from being the descendant of a family that has not too long ago come from somewhere else.
Mhm.
Because what I've noticed, at least in my family, the first generation removed from the people who moved, which in my case is my parents, they're like less interested. Well, they've always kind of less enthusiastic or eager to look. But then my generation of cousins, and
Here, my dad was perplexed. Yeah.
not that they're opposed to it, but like, just it's the way that it is, and that's it.
Part of it is, and I'm sure this applies to lots of people who are in this audience, isn't part of it, I worked so hard to assimilate here, to learn this language, to learn fluency, to fit in, to pass, and you want to go mucking around in what I left? What is wrong with you? Right? Isn't that part of it?
Yes, yes, yes. And sometimes that stems from trauma and expulsion and the reason why people left. Sometimes it stems from, like you're saying, the hard work that it takes to just make a foot for yourself in a place like the United States, and all that goes into learning English. And then suddenly, oh my God, my grandson wants to learn Arabic. How dare he? He wishes that I spoke to him all my life in Spanish. Well, it was such an effort for me to learn English.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
I remember my father's like 78 years old, and he turns to me and he says in Spanish, I guess we need to start speaking Spanish to each other all the time now, huh? I guess we stopped speaking English. And I was like, yes, finally, right?
Yeah, I'll tell you a story about my grandmother from Iraq, who spoke Judeo-Baghdadi Arabic for her entire life.
Take that apart.
Yeah.
Judeo-Baghdadi Arabic. My life is richer for knowing that that's a thing. Explain it, please.
A Jewish dialect from the Iraqi Jews of Baghdad that was spoken widely for 2,000 years and is now an endangered language because there's only 3 Jews left in Iraq, and there's no transmittal of this language to the generations. So I have these vivid memories of Mama Fortune, my grandmother, and her siblings and extended family members and friends sitting around Long Island living rooms, jabbering away in this language that they were desperate for us never to learn. They did not want us to learn this language because it was associated with the old world, the old life, the trauma of expulsion and all that. And to the point where when she got older and she was having dementia and suffering from these issues, suddenly she was reverting to Judeo-Baghdadi Arabic. The language that she wanted us all to forget was the first language that she was most comfortable speaking in.
Yes.
And it's devastating.
Yeah.
And especially when you know that language is going to disappear with your generation. My generation will be the end of Judeo-Baghdadi Arabic, and I don't know it. So
we departed from the original question, which is, do you think this is a generational thing, or is it particular to people who have this kind of complex either single or double immigration background?
I don't know. This is, I guess, something that I'm going to find out now as I go talking about this with lots of different kinds of communities. But I do think that it's a generational thing because my grandmother, it has to be at least something related to generational thing because abuela talks about how she would always move in Buenos Aires, sit as far away from her father as possible on the bus because she couldn't bear to hear him speak in Arabic. It gave her great shame that her father from Aleppo, Jewish from Syria, was in Buenos Aires speaking in Arabic. That to her was terrible. Now she sits in Peekskill and listens to the melancholic Arabic orchestras of Kulthum and wishes that she spoke as much Arabic as her father and her mother.
Yeah.
And so I do think that it's a generational thing. And I think that it's all of us don't appreciate the things that are closest to us. And then once we're a little bit removed, both for reasons of being further away from the trauma, but also just kind of having a more bird's eye view of everything is like it becomes easier to understand.
So we're going to open up, I know, for questions that you're going to be looking at in a few minutes, but I want to get you on the road. What happens when you set out? I mean, what are some of your first, you'd been to Buenos Aires before, I believe, right?
Yeah, but only with my grandparents and my parents and my brothers. And like when you go with family and when they, especially when there are people in your family who speak the language better than you are definitely relegated to the listener.
Right.
And so this was my first time in Argentina alone.
And so when you headed out into the territory that your great grandfather, your bisabuelo, worked in and lived in, what were some of the first things that struck you as you head out?
Well, the biggest thing that struck me, first of all, is that he did not work in a vacuum. That I think when it comes to family history projects, and I think a lot of people maybe who are here are interested in exploring their own family stories and their family's pasts. Um, I think that it's very easy to think, wow, my ancestor did such a unique thing. I'm never going to be able to find out what that was like. But the truth is, especially with migration, that these things do not happen in a vacuum, that people follow patterns and chains and connections and networks. And as it happens, there were hundreds of Syrian Jewish peddlers in the Andes Mountains of Argentina. And though I maybe was having trouble finding documented traces of Salim Salama, I was suddenly spending the night eating dinner in a Syrian Christian family's house, who was the descendants of traveling salespeople, and eating sfiha or lahmacun, which was a dish that Abuela had made for me in Peekskill my entire life.
Wow.
So the first thing that struck me was that there were traces of us everywhere I looked, in the place where I least expected it. Because here I was imagining Salim Salama going off into the countryside alone and completely isolated and doing whatever he could to make things work. When in reality, the history suggests that it was more likely that he was actually part of a network, and there were places known where he would stay, and there was comfortable, food for him. But at the same time, like there was also mingling with the local cultures and communities, and that was where the most interesting fusions happened.
What were some of the other ways that you picked up on traces aside from food, which is one of the most visceral?
Yeah, we've been talking a lot about language, and I think that language is one of the great marks of existence, which is an idea in this book and it's the title of our talk actually together now. But the idea that like, what are these things that represent our family's past that aren't that aren't birth certificates and DNA tests and things like that? Like, why are we the way that we are in the little everyday things because of the people who came before us? What impact do those people have on the way we live today? And for me, language is everything. Because especially me being the one who only learned English, when you hear a language that sounds familiar to you, but you don't know what it means, you know that it's that thing that we always spoken, that it was always spoken in my house. And so to arrive in Argentina and to meet like extended family members who I knew were related to me, speak a spellbinding blend of Spanish peppered with Arabic was
Wow.
really, really cool. And then to hear that over and over again in the mountains in the Andes was even cooler.
Did you hear? I'm wondering whether it started to seem important or unimportant to separate out the Argentine from the Syrian from the Jewish. I have a story in my head. When my son was born, my Mexican grandma, abuelita, which is grandma, that means little grandmother, right? Abuelita says to me in Spanish, because she really didn't speak English very well. She says to me in Spanish, be sure to hang something red over his crib. And I say, okay, why? And she says, because you need it to keep away the malo ojo, the evil eye. And I look at her and I say, okay, abuelita, is that Mexican? Is it Jewish? Or is it Polish? And she says, I don't know. You just have to keep away the malo ojo, right? And so the question to you, if anybody in the audience knows, by all means, and then you can also tell me about the chopped hard-boiled egg and the guacamole, but that's a different thing, right? Did it feel important to you in some way to understand the origins of things, or did it all feel like it didn't matter very much? You know, these were who people are now. Do you see what I'm asking, Jordan?
Yeah, definitely. First of all, I have an evil eye hanging in my room, and we hang them in our cars everywhere. Like
Okay. So
everybody.
I know it's not Syrian, George. So I'm going now. I've narrowed it down to Latin American and Jewish, right? I'm pretty sure.
I don't know. I think that it might be Middle Eastern. I don't know. Jewish, Middle Eastern, I have no idea. There are people who are now commenting in the
Oh,
chat,
good.
which
Yes.
is great.
Good.
Keep going.
Thank you, chat people. Keep bringing it
chat
on.
people.
We need to
That's
know.
awesome.
For years, I've wondered about the mal ojo. Right.
But does it matter? That's the thing. So can I talk about Kanya Makan quickly?
Of
This
course.
phrase. Okay, so Kanya Makan is how I start the book. It's the Arabic phrase for once upon a time.
Yeah.
And in a literal kind of version of the translation, it means it happened or it didn't happen, or it was or it wasn't so. So literally the way to start a story is saying, well, this might have happened or maybe it didn't, and then launching into a family story or a folk tale or whatever.
I just have to interrupt and say
Yeah.
that I'm loving these comments as they're coming in. Somebody just wrote in, so it's not just my family that's weird. Yes, absolutely. Now you understand. Anyway,
Maybe
proceed.
I guess that's probably the takeaway of this whole book. It's not just your family that's weird.
Not just my family. Right.
Not
Anyway,
just your family. Like, please,
go
like
on.
this is, yeah.
Right.
So Kanya Makan, it happened or it didn't happen. It was or it wasn't so. How does this apply to family searches and searches for genealogy and history and family storytelling, intergenerational storytelling? Does it matter if it's Jewish, Middle Eastern, or Latin American? Like, does it matter? Now that it's my story, now that it's our story, isn't it all of the above, regardless of where it comes from? Now, yes, as a journalist and as somebody who's working on a history project, I do want to parse out where this came from because I'm interested in the history element of these sorts of things, right? Like, where does this specifically come from? But at the end of the day, why does it matter? Does it matter? I'm not quite sure. Does it matter that if the family legends that we tell each other, does it matter if they're true?
Oh, that's such a good question, Jordan.
What do you think? I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know. I really don't know.
We're journalists, Cynthia. We have to chase.
Did my father really get gored in the bull ring by a baby bull when he snuck into the main bull ring in Mexico City and almost get gangrene?
Right.
You know, I want it to be true. Doesn't that just give it
That's
something?
enough.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes, that's enough. And here's the thing. So,
Right.
so Salim Salama, one of his best stories is that he would sit on the corner of a major intersection in La Boca in Buenos Aires, a very important Syrian Jewish neighborhood.
Remember, we're back in the city now. This is the big bustling city. La
big
Boca
bustling,
is super bustling in the big bustling city, right?
super bustling. And also, of course, the home of Boca Juniors, the soccer team, which soccer is a big part of all this
But
too.
we digress, right?
Digress. Salim Salama would sit on the corner and he would read the newspaper in Spanish to his Syrian Jewish friends who mostly didn't speak Spanish. They all spoke Arabic, but he was happy that he spoke enough Spanish to be able to read the newspaper and read the stories out loud to his friends and translate them to Arabic. He enjoyed the attention so much that by the time he got to the end of the newspaper, he would make up stories. He would just make up news articles and hope that people would keep listening to him. And one could take that as like, oh, wow, haha, funny story. This guy was a liar and an exaggerator. And why are you following his trade route in the Andes, you idiot? Jordan, why are you wasting your time? But I think that if you think about it a little bit more closely and analyze that, why would somebody take the time to tell these stories, even if they weren't true? And it's the immigrant experience. It's finding a way to be listened to be heard in a world where you feel like you do not belong.
Right.
For me, yeah, that was transformative because suddenly I was here telling a story in a world where I did not feel like I belonged in the same way, though I wasn't.
A last question I want to ask you before we open it up to the folks, who I'm sure have a ton of really interesting questions.
Yeah.
Is you start learning as you're learning more about Salim Salama. It's not all nice. You learn that he beat his kids, right? what happens in you and in your search as this character you've gone after becomes even more complex, not just fathering children by women to whom he's not married, perhaps, although you never actually found any of those, I think, right? But
Spoiler.
yeah, spoiler, sorry.
No, that's fine. That's
but learning about the aspects of his character that are unsavory. What's that like in your search?
it was a big challenge with the story was how much do you lean into this vulnerability also for a book that people will hypothetically be reading. How much do you want to say about your family that is not too savory, that's not great? um it's very interesting. I think one of the more illuminating twists in this story um and in this project and this experience is that about halfway through this whole process, so like maybe around 2020, 2021, Abuela came to me with her own secret book. Fictions and poems, not nonfiction, not history like Abuelo, but fiction and poems that she wrote.
Fíjase nada más. Wow.
Wow.
Right. Yeah.
Hidden in the back of her recipe book, stuffed away in a kitchen cabinet in her house. And I was like, my God, I have not only one, but two grandparents with secret books. This is too much. But starting to read Abuela's stories, I started to tell in a very specific way the difference between the way she told stories and the way Abuelo told stories, and the stories that she chose to remember and the stories that he chose to remember, and the gender disparities in this Arab Jewish community that's a very masculine, kind of macho culture in Argentina. And what does that mean for the stories that I was told and the stories that I was chasing? So that's where I wrestle with these questions of like, is it actually right for me to be following the egotistical gallivantings of my great grandfather who fathered illegitimate children in the mountains? Like, or is that not fair to my great grandmother and her memory and how she might have felt about all these rumors and all these things? And why wasn't her story more available to me? Just like, why did it take so long for Abuela to come forth with her writings? And it's a big question in the book, and it's something that I end up about halfway through grappling with in a very big way. So, but in that grappling, I also talk about kind of what it was like, the fact that Salim Salama, by a lot of accounts, just wasn't the nicest guy.
Yeah. Let's go ahead and open and bring some questions in.
Yeah.
Jordan, and I'm going to let you grab a few.
Okay.
Let's
So
whatever you might
first,
want on.
yeah. So first, I saw a couple of things that I wanted to speak to. So the first of all, somebody mentioning the New York Times article from last week about the Endangered Language Alliance in New York and Judeo-Baghdadi Arabic being one of those endangered languages. Ross Perlin, a friend of mine who's one of the founders of the Endangered Language Alliance, and I are going to be doing an event together in a couple of weeks in New York, talking about language and migration in New York City specifically, and what those, what those stories entail. So that's something here. I'm so glad that somebody shared that. And then somebody else mentioned Kantika, and at the Jewish Museum in Manhattan later this month, I'm going to be doing an event with Elizabeth Graver, the author of Kantika, with the Jewish Book Council at the Jewish Museum. So there's definitely a lot of synergies, and I'm glad that people are pulling out the stories that they remember that have to do with these kinds of stories. And then everybody's making I mean, like, it's hard for me to go through all these comments, sharing experiences and things, but I really encourage you to look through this because it's already a treasure trove of recollections. And but I don't see that many questions. Somebody asked, can I write the phrase Kanya Makan? So I will do that. But does anybody have a question about, it could be about the book, it could be about this story, but it could also be about finding, using the tools of a journalist to discover your family's past. My New York City events will be in person.
And we've seen a billion comments come through about evil eyes, which I think are kind of universal, honestly. And so the redness of the evil eye remains a great question.
Somebody asks, for whom did I write this book and what is the audience that I intended to reach? And I do love this question because the book actually begins with an email to my grandfather that I wrote to him when I finished. And I said, hi, abuelo, like, hola, abuelo. And then I write the emails in Spanish, but they're translated here. And I say, here's the new book. It's not finished. I don't think family stories ever are, not completely, but that's okay. I've been writing it for so long and it's taken so many forms that eventually I realized it was time to let it rest for now. Still, I'm glad that I wrote down what I did even if only to make sure that I'll remember some little details and moments from what's been a very beautiful past few years of our lives. So I'd say my first answer to this question is that I wrote it for my family, because we are a family of oral histories and oral storytelling. And I have grown up with this kind of fear of forgetting. I think that that's why, Cynthia, my guess is that you're the same way. I think that that's why I became a nonfiction writer, why I decided to become a journalist, was because I'm so fascinated by stories and by how they make the world such a richer place that I'm just desperately afraid of forgetting all of these beautiful details, especially when it comes to my family. And I see so much of these details and these cultures in danger of disappearing.
Yeah.
So first thing, I wrote it down so that we would never forget. That was the most important thing for me, because I also never really came across my family story on the general audience shelves of literature. Um, there were definitely academic texts, but like nothing really accessible. And then that's the second part of this, is that I want this to be accessible for anybody and everybody who wants to read it, because I think that, again, more people than we think have a very similar experience. Not that they're Syrian Jews who went to the Argentine Andes, but that we contain these blends and these mixes that are really powerful and really special, but we think that we're the only ones. And so we just kind of use it as a way to block that out and feel like this is too overwhelming to touch. When in
Yeah.
reality, these communities exist that have answers.
Well, the other thing that you've done that I love, and if there's to the extent that people in this audience are young enough for this to sink in, I'm going to evangelize just a little bit about it. I mean, obviously you couldn't talk to Salim Salama, who was no longer living, but you entered this process of insane curiosity when you were young enough to be able to get people who were still very much alive and could talk to you. And I know so many people. One of the things that happens as you grow up and get older and have kids is that at some point you turn around and say, "Oh my God, I have so much I want to ask my grandparents about. I have so much I didn't learn, and they're not here." Or my parents even, right? And they're not here for me to talk to. And even though, like, I began grilling my grandma, about life in Mexico City and stuff before she died, it wasn't enough. And so if anybody's there and has access to those relatives right now, I'm like, do it, because you'll be really sad that you didn't 25 years from now.
Right.
Do you see some? There's some interesting questions that have just popped up, Jordan. Like the person who asks, "Is there one thing you discovered that did not surprise you in retrospect? Like you thought, now this checks out." And I might add an extension to that question, which is not necessarily just now this checks out, but oh, this explains something. Right?
So much. Oh, this explains something.
Yeah.
So it goes back to this like mark of an existence idea, right?
Yeah.
These like little things in our lives that evoke the memory of people who came
Right.
before us.
Yeah.
My grandparents' house, which I described at the beginning of this talk,
The New
has
York.
a lot in New York, in Peekskill. Yep. The only one. They, in that house, there are so many things. There are so many objects, little everyday items, but also kind of like family trinkets and things that I never thought of twice about. I was just like, oh yeah, that's that thing that's in Abuela and Abuela's house. But then once I did this project and I started digging and asking questions, suddenly there was a story behind every object. And it was obvious, it was clear. Why was there a hookah pipe weighed down with salt on the top of my grandparents' bookshelf? It was because my great great grandmother from Damascus was a hookah smoking fanatic who was so obsessed with smoking hookah that it's the picture on her gravestone in Buenos Aires, which I tracked down, is her
Wow.
smoking the pipe that's on the shelf of my grandparents.
And the salt?
The salt is just to weigh it down because
Oh,
they needed something to weigh it down.
okay.
Or maybe not. I actually never asked specifically about the salt, so I'll
There
call
you
them.
go. There
They
you
will.
go. It might be like the malo ojo. There's a special thing about the salt, Who knows? Right.
Yeah, you never know. But then other things like, why did they have the books that they have? Why do they have the kitchen items that they have, like the different kinds of utensils? I mean, everything points towards this kind of hodgepodge of backgrounds, and it all makes sense now. Like everything makes sense to down to like, I spend a lot of time now every year in Buenos Aires, many months out of each year actually living and working there, especially because of this book. And one of the things that I realized is there's a very distinct sense of what an Argentinian house feels like inside. And then I realized all along, I'm like, I like this because this is my grandparents' house. this house has been over the years kind of like little by little renovated and designed. Whenever something broke, they would replace it with something that made it feel more like Buenos Aires. And that to me was amazing. Um, so yeah, there were plenty of things that were like something like these aha moments.
How did you find Judaism handed down in odd ways? The reason I asked this question, I remember when I was working in South America, spending time with a Brazilian, actually, who had grown up in a community that he thought had nothing to do with being Jewish. But it was as an adult that he began wondering why they always lit candles on Fridays. And nobody knew.
Yep.
It was just a thing that they did. They lit candles on Fridays, right?
Yeah.
And we would encounter stories like that from time to time, just talking to people in different countries of Latin America. And I'm wondering whether you found that in this doubly removed community that you were traveling in.
Yeah, I love that. And I love when people come up with examples like that because I think that stems back in a lot of ways to the Jews of the Inquisition in Spain when they were having to hide their Jewish identity. And there's a great story of the people who would hang pork in the windows of their houses most visibly were actually the Jewish families in hiding.
Wow.
But then also people who converted, but they maintained certain traditions, and those traditions went down, passed down, and passed down, and passed down
Right.
because they were Jewish. How is Judaism passed? The question you asked, like, how is it passed down in my family, or how did I see it evoked in different ways?
Both questions, really, but I was wondering whether you had any experiences like us with the Brazilian fellow of being out among people who were
Yeah.
saying things and practicing and doing things that they didn't even understand were connected to multiple generations back.
Yeah. I remember a phone call with a 90-year-old Argentinian journalist from a rural town called Pergamino in the province of Buenos Aires. So like a pampa town, like the plains. And he grew up on a pig farm. His name is Riccardo Biglieri. And he's an Italian guy of Italian descent, right? And I got to him because he had written an article for a folklore blog about a Turco traveling salesman who would go to his house when he was a kid in the 30s. So obviously, I tried to get in touch with him. And when I spoke with him, he said something very interesting when he was describing this Turco. And he said, I'm not quite sure what his religion was, but he wasn't Catholic like us. But what I do know is that he never ate meat in our house. He only brought meat with him that he salted and cured. And if not, he would only eat dairy. And so we called him, as a joke, casarino, which is actually a word that doesn't exist in Spanish, but he used that word and he said it means hunter. And because they would make fun of this guy because he wasn't eating meat. And that's clearly a signal that this man was Jewish.
Right.
Like very obviously, because Jews who are observant don't mix meat and dairy, or they don't eat meat that's not kosher out of the home.
Right. Right.
And he didn't realize it. And why would he have realized it? He was 5 and now he's 90 and he lives in Pergamino. Like there were all sorts of things there that it made total sense why, but being Jewish impacted his childhood in some way.
Here's a question that one of our audience people asks about what kinds of sources you use. Did you use any external sources like Ancestry, et cetera, or just rely on word of mouth? That what you did is too ambitious for most of us to contemplate in our spare time, but there are ways that this kind of search can be commenced by just about anybody who's really interested in it. So what do you suggest for somebody who's not necessarily going to do a multi-country traveling trip?
Right. You don't have to travel far to do these kinds of projects. My grandparents did 23andMe. I didn't, and I don't know. I have this like hesitation, not for any specific reason, but just because I like the challenge of trying to track these things down through understanding and through storytelling. I think it's cool. But they did it, and that certainly helped. But really, the outside sources that helped me the most were scholars and academics who study these migrations and these communities. Because like I said, again, even if it's the most unique thing that you could ever possibly imagine, there's probably one scholar out there who has studied something related to it. And so these people were my lifeline, and they were the ones who connected me to people on the ground, who could help me with this. But even if I hadn't gone, just the information that they had and the phone calls and the conversations that we had by email were enough to open up whole new worlds of understanding. So really treating it like a researcher, like a journalist or a scholar, using primary and secondary sources interviews that you can do, but also interviews that have been done by other people, and then books and any kinds of text and academic resources that you could find about these communities was really, really, really important.
So you would start big. I'm exploring, here's my family story. I'm exploring Syrian Jews who came to Argentina, or I'm exploring immigrants who came to Argentina and ended up as turcos in the mountains above Mendoza, or what kinds of, I think people who don't do this on a regular basis wonder what kinds of start off questions you ask for a leap this big.
I start out always with the most specific thing. So like saying exactly what I'm looking for. But usually the people who I would speak with did not respond to, like, it's when they did say, oh my God, I'm an expert in Syrian Jewish traveling salesman in the Andes Mountains. I was like, this is fantastic. I found the person for me.
Actually
But
find such a person.
not Syrian Jewish traveling salesmen in the Andes Mountains, but definitely Middle Eastern peddlers in the countryside of Argentina, which
Wow.
is close enough, honestly.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. And then also historians in Buenos Aires who deal with the Syrian Jewish community more broadly in Argentina who had knowledge of it. But but yeah, being very specific and then paying close attention and following up with people, no matter what their entryway into that topic was, because painting the full picture around the very specific idea was really important to me. And then when it comes to like asking questions of people, I talk a lot about like the importance of asking. These are things that people like you have actually helped me learn. But as a journalist, like asking open-ended questions that elicit storytelling as opposed to closed questions that could be like the name of a place and that's it. So like describing things like what was the street like where you grew up, or describe to me your walk to school in the morning, or how do you think your mother felt when she moved from Syria to Argentina? Those kinds of questions where it could take multiple of them to actually get a story as an answer, but then you will get a story as an answer. Another thing a tactic that I use, which I really like for this, and it works in journalism too, is putting two people in conversation with each other
Mm.
and then just listening.
Mm-hmm.
Because sometimes I don't even know what questions I should be asking, but somebody else does. So I put Abuelo in conversation with Maria Chero de Azar, who's an expert in Sephardic Jewish history in Argentina. And for 3 hours, they sat together and they spoke at length. And I recorded it and I transcribed it. And it was just, it's itself a treasure.
Oh my
This
gosh, that
conversation.
must have been amazing.
It
Yeah,
was amazing.
listening to that. And I have there's one other an interesting follow-up question on this topic of complex family members that we were talking about earlier.
Yeah.
Elena, who says I have some not so nice history about ancestors as well, how to reconcile with it. And my friend who's a historian criticized me for thinking that was relevant since it's history. How might you have reacted if you had learned, for example, that Salim Salama was not just maybe a little loose in his marital vows and a little violent with his offspring, but a genuinely bad, an altogether bad person, a cheater, a child abuser, whatever.
Yeah.
How do we make those decisions, and what is the role of climbing back into history, particularly when it involves your own family?
I think that it goes back to an earlier question, which is who is the book written for, or are you writing a book? Because if you're writing for, like me, kind of wide readership, that's where it gets more complicated because people in the family who are alive would be very sensitive to that kind of information being shared, especially if it's something that you discover. Whereas if you aren't working on a project like that, but you just are doing it for the family's memory and safekeeping, then maybe you don't have to reconcile it. Maybe it's just history. Maybe you can treat it like a historian. But I think that when it's your own family and the audience is public, that kind of, for better or for worse, in my case, was important to me to have to deal with because I'm sensitive not only to the story that I'm telling, but also to like the people in my life who I love, who the story impacts.
Yes, and it's your abuelo is still with us, right? Abuelo
Yeah.
is still very much alive, right? And it's his father that you're writing about. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so what comes next for you? There's a note in your book that you write in the intro where you say it's not finished. I don't think it ever will be. What do you mean by that, and what's next in this search for you?
The search continues and has continued since I finished writing the book. It's continued since the book came out. We have these WhatsApp group chats now called Salamas por el Mundo, which are
No,
the salams of the world.
no.
So yeah, and people from all sorts of countries who have the last name Salama, and also people like we have a family one. I have a network of Salamas everywhere, um, which is is really special. And continuing those conversations has been great. And just continuing to dig through this bottomless barrel of family anecdotes in the essence of remembering and of preserving and of transmitting these stories and these cultures is really cool. I mean, the process of learning Arabic, like what I did with Spanish, kind of clawing back my linguistic loss as a kid, I want to do that with Arabic. And I feel like that's personally the kind of thing that's top of mind now. And maybe even turning
A
to
lot
Iraq.
harder than Spanish, compañero.
It's a lot harder than
A
Spanish.
lot harder than Spanish, right?
Yeah.
Especially for
But
those
there are
who didn't
resources.
grow up with it, right?
Yeah, and like, do I want to learn Judeo-Baghdadi Arabic, even if I
Oh,
have no
definitely,
practice with?
definitely.
Yeah, but how?
I want
There's
to
no
do this
practice.
conversation again in Judeo-Baghdadi Arabic, right? Yeah, I'm going to have to do some catch up also, but
Yeah, call me in a couple of years. We'll. um,
But I
uh,
also tell me
yeah.
just a little bit more about what's surfacing in the WhatsApp chat groups. I mean, are you actually finding anybody who's like, yeah, I think I might really be related to you? I have a personal interest in this, of course. If I start one, do I get a Gorney who turns up from the mountains of Mexico? This is what
Yeah, well, not Salamas from the mountains of the Andes, but like Salamas who are Salamas. Like the people from the Andes, I realized wouldn't have the last name. But what this project did was it united a very disparate family that has shared stories and shared histories. I mean, one of our distant cousins is one of the last 12 Jews currently living in Syria.
Wow. Wow.
So connecting with him, a fifth cousin of my grandfather, but realizing that we can trace it back through the stories and the other anecdotes and things.
And now you have a
is
personal tie to watch the Jews disappear from Syria. Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
And WhatsApping with him and just chatting in broken Arabic and broken English is really interesting. So it's never, the family history project is never ending. The Jordan as a writer project is also hopefully never ending. And I've
May
actually
it never end, Jordan. May it
what?
never end. May it never end.
Thank you. No, but turning my gaze, as you know, to stories of migration more broadly that don't have to do with my family. So especially in a city like New York, that's becoming a new indigenous Latin American capital, for example, of the city. It's been very interesting to do reporting along those lines and think about my own family story in the context of the debates that everybody's talking about now has been really cool.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so very much for your time, Jordan. It's been a delight, and it's been a special delight reading all the cool comments coming in from the side. And this has been recorded, so I think we'll get a chance to go through and look at them in more detail.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah.
yeah. Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you all commenters for teaching me a little bit more about my own abuelita as well as Jordan's family.
Yeah, and I'm sorry for all the questions that we couldn't. There are questions now that I see that we weren't able to get to, but that link that I put in the chat is the guest book, and that's your way of also keeping in touch with me. If you would like, I'd love to hear your stories. I'd love to make these communities. I'd love to see you across the US or come to your community and speak about this and share it in more detail, or do one of these family story classes with you that we do with My Jewish Learning. So I'm really, really happy to be in touch with everybody here. And I feel like we're building this community of curious people. And Cynthia, to do it with you is just like, it's so amazing because you have that within you and you've gone on to do these amazing things with National Geographic, which I'm just hoping that I can maybe somehow
I'm just
follow.
convinced we are going to figure out that we're cousins, Jordan. That's how it's going to work out. Yeah.
I hope so.
Okay.
Very cool.
Gran
All right.
abrazo y muchas gracias.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you to everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye.